I heard the splash before I saw her. One moment I was watching a Navy SEAL silently rise from a stealth dive with a plastic dummy slung over his back, and the next, a shriek echoed through the air like a dolphin on helium. There, in the dead center of the training zone, floating proudly on an inflatable flamingo, was a middle-aged woman in leopard print swimwear and oversized sunglasses. She lifted her wine tumbler triumphantly like she'd conquered the Atlantic. She had no idea she'd just broken into a military-grade aquatic facility and was now being watched by 6 elite operatives with combat clearance and 0 patience for nonsense. And when she called 911 to report a paramilitary cult doing synchronized water warfare, it didn't just blow the mission. It blew up the entire HOA. 2 weeks earlier, everything had been smooth. I had just returned to my cabin from my contract assignment overseas, a remote lakeside property nestled quietly beyond the cul-de-sac of a sleepy HOA-run neighborhood. Unlike most neighbors, I preferred silence. No bake sales, no carolers, and definitely no HOA drama. That's why I purchased the last property on the end, with a double lot and a reinforced 8-foot privacy fence. What no one around me knew, because they didn't need to, was that the backyard wasn't just for barbecues. It was approved and authorized by federal clearance as a temporary off-grid aquatic training zone for my old Navy SEAL unit. Once a year, a handful of us would gather here, away from the world, to run underwater drills, low-light swimming formations, and escape tactics. It was legal, it was licensed, and it was supposed to be secret. This year was different. The team had arrived 3 days ago, and we were already deep into simulations. We used blackout covers on the perimeter, underwater comms, even infrared markers invisible to the naked eye. Everything was dialed in. That night's scenario involved an escape drill, timed, full gear, silent. The team was 10 minutes into the simulation when I stepped back inside to double-check our thermal mapping data. That's when I heard it. That ungodly splash. I bolted to the sliding door and saw what looked like a scene from a reality TV show. There she was, Karen. That Karen. The one who once tried to fine me for not trimming my pine tree to neighborhood height standards. The one who stormed my doorstep last Christmas because my wreath had too many colors. She was now doing breaststrokes between black-suited operatives, seemingly unaware or completely unbothered. To my horror, she waved at me. "This pool is divine. Why have you been hiding it?" she called, laughing. My blood boiled. Not only had she trespassed on a secured facility, but she was now physically in the middle of an active SEAL mission. The operators were frozen in confusion, not sure whether to initiate a security protocol or pretend it was part of the simulation. "Karen," I growled, storming outside, "get out. Now. You have no idea what you've just interrupted." She flipped her hair like a shampoo commercial and took a sip of her wine. "Oh, relax, you don't own water," she said dismissively. "HOA bylaws say recreational spaces must be shared. You've been hoarding this little oasis for yourself." I couldn't believe it. The woman had climbed an 8-foot locked gate and bypassed at least 2 warning signs that clearly said restricted access. That wasn't ignorance. That was deliberate. One of the SEALs surfaced slowly behind her and whispered, "You want us to initiate the swim tether, sir?" The look on his face wasn't angry. It was bemused. The entire team was barely holding in their laughter. "No," I replied through clenched teeth, "stand down. I'll handle this." Karen, now floating proudly on her inflatable bird, pulled out her phone. "Actually, I think I'll just call the authorities. You've got a bunch of creepy men in masks swimming in formation at night. Pretty sure that counts as a cult." I felt my eye twitch. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up to my driveway, lights flashing. Karen greeted them from the pool like she was hosting a 4th of July barbecue. "Officers," she called, sloshing wine everywhere. "Thank goodness. This man has been hosting midnight rituals with what I believe are armed militants." I was forced to leap in just to protect the neighborhood. I stepped forward before they could say anything. "Gentlemen," I said, pulling my identification from my wallet. Jake Mercer. This is federally authorized training under Department of Defense Contract SEAL Bravo 27. These men are Navy SEALs. Everything here is legal and secured. Both officers blinked. One of them, Officer Ryan, recognized me immediately. Jake? Weren't you my CO's instructor in Coronado back in 14? I nodded. Still am, part-time. Karen's face changed from smug to confused. What do you mean legal? She asked. He can't just build a pool and turn it into a secret Marine base. Ma'am, Ryan said slowly, you just trespassed onto a government-authorized training facility. That's a felony. And you called it in under false pretenses. That's abuse of emergency services. But I'm the HOA president, she shrieked. You're not even on the registered board, I added. You were voted out last year. But you never gave up the laminated badge you made at Office Depot. The other officer snorted. Karen stood up in the pool, now shivering and unsteady on her flow tie. This is outrageous. You people are dangerous. This entire neighborhood is at risk of becoming a militarized zone. At that, 3 SEALs emerged from the pool in perfect sync, their masks glinting in the moonlight. One of them saluted the officers. Karen screamed and dropped her wine glass. The police calmly advised her to leave the premises. She refused, demanding a citizens' tribunal, and threatening to call the mayor. They gave her 2 choices: leave voluntarily or be detained for trespassing. She screamed something about deep state conspiracies, and then finally climbed out of the pool, dripping and defeated, holding her phone above her head like it was Excalibur. The second she was gone, the SEALs exploded into laughter. One of them imitated her screech. Another mockingly floated on her flamingo, whispering, "This pool is divine." I didn't laugh. Not yet. She had just endangered a live training operation. I was furious. And unfortunately, the worst part wasn't her intrusion. It was what happened next. Because Karen, ever the drama queen, went home, edited her pool footage, and uploaded it to social media with a caption that read, "Breaking. HOA hero stops military cult training in backyard." It took less than 12 hours for the video to go viral. Hashtags like #SEL Pool Party and #Karen's Navy trended. National news outlets began calling. My inbox exploded. The DoD called. The liaison wasn't pleased. And me? I realized the woman hadn't just splashed into my pool. She'd just dropped a torpedo into my life. The mission was compromised. The team would have to be relocated. And Karen? She had no idea what she'd started. But she was about to find out. Ask ChatGPT. The morning after Karen's late-night cannonball into classified Navy SEAL training, I woke up to find my phone vibrating nonstop. I didn't even need to open it to know what was happening. I had that same sinking feeling I used to get during missions when something had gone sideways before you even got eyes on it. Sure enough, when I unlocked the screen, I was hit with a flurry of texts, calls, and a few very unfortunate news headlines. Mysterious military operation exposed in quiet suburb was one. Brave HOA President foils secret armed cult was another. But the worst one? A clip with over 200,000 views of Karen floating on her flamingo, dramatically narrating how she had infiltrated a rogue tactical group operating under the disguise of a backyard pool party. She even added dramatic music over it. The footage was ridiculous, filled with shaky shots of SEALs mid-training looking confused, while Karen talked over it like she was on a reality TV show. At one point, she whispered into the camera, "I might not make it out, but at least the truth will." To the untrained eye, it might look like a bizarre home movie. But to anyone who knew what to look for, the clips exposed far more than she realized. Equipment placement, team structure, comms gear, and even a few flashes of restricted-use wetsuits that weren't supposed to be seen by the public. In under 24 hours, she had managed to broadcast sensitive footage to the internet under the banner of HOA drama. The fallout was immediate. By noon, my secure line rang. It was Lieutenant Commander Mason, my longtime contact from the DoD. He skipped the pleasantries. His tone was clipped and flat. I already knew what he was going to say. Mercer, the op is compromised. Extract the team. Shred everything non-essential. We'll reassign protocols. I know, I said, pinching the bridge of my nose. I'm not even mad at you, he added. I watched the footage. Honestly, I can't believe it happened. This woman, was she intoxicated? Probably. Or just insane. Both, he said. Either way, we'll handle the security angle. But if that footage goes to the wrong person, you could be looking at serious civilian blowback. And if any of those operators are ID'd, this could become a safety issue. I knew he was right. Karen's antics weren't just annoying. They were dangerous. She had entered a space designated for classified activity and not only interfered but broadcast it. But what was worse was that she was being celebrated for it by a growing number of suburban keyboard warriors. HOA groups were sharing her clip like it was an instructional video on citizen activism. One page even posted, "This is what happens when brave homeowners stand up to backyard warlords." As if I was the villain. I stepped outside to clear my head and was immediately greeted by the sound of Karen's voice blaring from a small crowd at the cul-de-sac. She was giving what could only be described as a press conference from her driveway. Folding chairs were lined up. A few residents, mostly the nosy ones with nothing better to do, were gathered around. And Karen? She was standing behind a lectern that had the HOA logo duct-taped to the front of it. She held a printed image of me mid-yell from the footage, and spoke like she was running for mayor. "This is a call for neighborhood justice," she declared. "We must ensure transparency in all corners of our community. Secret swim drills are just the beginning. What's next?" "Paratroopers from the dog park." The crowd murmured. Some laughed. Others seemed unsure. But the worst part was people were listening. Karen had taken what should have been a humiliating moment and spun it into a personal platform. I had seen psychological operations unfold in the field before, but never with this much passive-aggressive flair. I wanted to shut it down, but I knew that would only escalate things. So I decided to go quiet. Let her feel like she had the stage, and in the meantime, I would prepare my counter. That evening, I held a private gathering in my backyard. This time, not for drills, but for strategy. I invited 5 of the more reasonable board members: retired Air Force pilot named Ben, a nurse named Clara, a sharp-witted guy named Raj who used to work logistics for FEMA, and 2 veterans from the National Guard who'd dealt with Karen before. They came in cautiously, some still wearing work clothes, and I laid everything out. The footage. The breach. The operational shutdown. I didn't need to exaggerate. The facts spoke for themselves. Ben shook his head. "She doesn't even understand what she did. She thinks she's the neighborhood hero. She's turned this into performance art," Raj added. "She doesn't want a resolution. She wants attention." Clara leaned forward. "So what's your move?" "Proof," I said. "Documented, undeniable, and delivered straight to the board. But more than that, I want to show exactly what she's done, not just to me or the team, but to this entire community." We split the task. Clara would help gather incident reports. Karen had made over 39 111 calls in the last year, mostly for things like suspicious gardening and unauthorized sprinkler activity. Raj would comb through HOA spending. Rumors had been circulating for months that Karen had funneled funds into beautification efforts that only benefited her house. Ben and the veterans would review drone footage from my backyard security to extract timestamps, identify violations, and organize them into a clear timeline. I had a full video archive from that night. Karen walking in, ignoring warning signs, splashing into classified drills, mocking the operators, and, most importantly, lying to law enforcement. For my part, I wrote a statement, not just detailing the operation's purpose, but the layers of security and legal permission behind it. I highlighted her trespassing, her falsified emergency call, and her reckless upload of sensitive material. But I did it without anger. No insults. No shouting. Just facts. Because if there's one thing that cuts through drama, it's cold, irrefutable logic. While we worked, Karen ramped up her campaign. She posted new videos titled things like, How to Spot a Hidden War Zone in Your Neighborhood and Jake the Warlord, a Poolside Menace. In one clip, she wore aviator sunglasses and pointed at my property with a broomstick, calling it Ground Zero for aquatic terror. That's when I decided it was time to escalate, subtly. I updated my external cameras with motion sensors and installed small, clear signage that read, This property is monitored by federal defense contractors. Unauthorized entry will trigger automatic reporting. It wasn't a bluff. I was now required to report any further civilian interference to the Navy. Karen noticed immediately. The next morning, she came storming down my driveway holding one of the new signs in her hand. This is intimidation, she screeched. No, I said calmly. This is legal protection. You don't want to test what happens if you cross that line again. She sputtered something about civil liberties and marched off. But I saw it in her eyes. For the first time, she wasn't certain she had the upper hand. I wasn't going to fight Karen in her arena. I had no interest in HOA politics, public shaming, or lawn sign wars. But I had one thing she didn't. The truth, a highly trained support team, and a mountain of evidence. She'd swum into the deep end. Now she was about to find out how cold it really got. By the time Karen's third video hit 500,000 views and she'd given an interview to a low-tier conspiracy podcast called The Backyard Chronicles, I knew I had to pivot from defense to offense. She wasn't slowing down. She was accelerating. Her latest claims were so absurd they bordered on comedy, like the time she told the podcaster that she saw a submarine periscope in the kiddie pool, or that the birds flying over Jake's house might be drones disguised as eagles. But the scariest part wasn't how wild her accusations had gotten, it was how many people were starting to believe her. In a world flooded with half-truths and attention addiction, one determined Karen with a smartphone and zero shame could do more damage than an entire squadron of misinformed bureaucrats. I didn't waste energy arguing with her online. That was her battlefield, not mine. Instead, I focused on building a case that would unravel her narrative publicly and completely. It wasn't about humiliation, though part of me wouldn't mind watching her eat her words. It was about control. I needed to flip the power dynamic before her antics cost more than a few laughs and operational setback. If Karen wanted a spotlight, I'd give her one, with her own actions playing on loop. The first step of my counterstrike was securing the support of the quieter residents, the ones who weren't part of her drama club. I knocked on doors with a clipboard, polite and straightforward. No rants. No begging. I showed them aerial footage of her scaling my fence, stepping over federal warning signs, interrupting the SEAL team in the middle of a dive drill, and screaming "aquatic terrorists" into her phone while holding a wine glass. I asked them one question: would you let someone like this decide the rules for your home? Most people didn't even need to answer. They shook their heads and asked if she had really done all that. The footage didn't lie. Word spread quietly. Even among HOA members who didn't like me or couldn't care less about national defense, one thing united them: everyone hated a liar. Especially one who made them look like fools. But Karen didn't notice the shift. She was too busy planning a new HOA initiative that she called Neighborhood Rescue Readiness, claiming it was time for the community to be equipped to handle militant infiltrations. She passed out flyers with military-themed fonts and photoshopped herself in camouflage saluting in front of an American flag. On the back was a list of her emergency training tips, which included gems like practice whistle commands and install decoy cameras to confuse enemies. Then she crossed a line I never thought she'd be dumb enough to approach. She tried to break into the pool area again, but this time in disguise. It was a Friday evening, and I had just stepped into the house to grab a protein bar when my motion sensors triggered. I checked the monitor. There she was, hunched and awkward in full camouflage, wearing night vision goggles from some Halloween clearance bin. She rolled across the grass like she thought she was in a spy movie, clutching a plastic walkie-talkie. My first reaction was disbelief. My second was morbid curiosity. So I waited. She crept toward the pool with a small camera strapped to her chest. I watched as she narrated in whispers. "This is Agent Karen, and I've infiltrated the warlord's base. I see barrels. Possibly weapons-grade chlorine. Wait, is that a mine?" She pointed at a weighted training buoy. Then she took one step too close to the far edge of the pool, where we'd placed the sonar detection trigger, a leftover SEAL tool that activated harmless water jets when motion was detected. A loud whoosh of pressurized water shot up right next to her, causing her to shriek and fall backward into the pool with a comical splash that would have made an Olympic diver wince. Her camera short-circuited immediately. I stepped outside slowly, letting the spotlight overhead flicker on. Karen came up sputtering, tangled in her own camera strap. "You can't do this. You set a trap. You assaulted me with pool hydraulics." I didn't yell. I didn't move fast. I just walked over to the edge and said calmly, "You trespassed again. You've entered a federal training zone that's been clearly marked. Your footage? Confiscated under Homeland Security protocols. You've triggered a second breach warning. That means I'm now legally required to submit your identity for tracking." She froze in the water, teeth chattering. "You're bluffing." I stepped back and nodded toward a small device on my patio wall. A green light blinked steadily. She climbed out, muttering threats under her breath, dripping water everywhere as she waddled to the gate, only to find it locked. She banged on it until I let her out. I said nothing, just stood there with folded arms. Her face was red, humiliated, and twitching with rage. She didn't say another word, but I knew she wouldn't stay silent for long. The next day, the footage from my external cams, clean, quiet, and professionally cut, was packaged and delivered to the HOA board. But I didn't just send the video. I attached a 30-page document titled Ongoing Trespass and Disruption Summary, Karen M. Inside was everything. Timestamps, photos, security footage, audio transcriptions of her calls, and a list of every HOA bylaw she had violated. It was damning, organized, and impossible to dispute. At the next board meeting, she showed up in her usual outfit, sun hat, clipboard, and overly large sunglasses like she was shielding her soul from accountability. She began with her normal routine, rattling off her community safety concerns, but this time the board stopped her. Raj, the logistics guy, stood up with the packet in hand. "Karen," he said, "before we move on to your agenda, we need to discuss this document." She glanced at it and scoffed. "Oh, is that from Jake? He's just mad I'm exposing him. That's what guilty people do. They build spreadsheets." Ben cleared his throat. "It's not a spreadsheet. It's a legal record. And it includes your unauthorized entries onto federal property, false emergency reports, misappropriation of HOA funds for personal projects, and ongoing harassment of a contracted federal agent." Karen paled. "Harassment? That's ridiculous. I was protecting this community." Clara, quiet until now, slid a photo across the table. Karen mid-cannonball. Another one. Karen holding a bottle of rose, yelling at a Navy SEAL. Then the one of her nighttime infiltration in camo, water dripping from her goggles. "You weren't protecting us," Clara said. "You were embarrassing us." The room was silent. Karen's jaw clenched, eyes darting for any escape. She started to argue again, but this time no one listened. The board voted unanimously to suspend her indefinitely from all HOA meetings and committees. She wasn't technically evicted, but her influence vanished overnight. And yet, somehow, Karen didn't quit. Not fully. A week later, she set up a lawn chair at the edge of my property line with a sign that read, "Free Karen or political prisoner of backyard tyranny." She sat there for hours, even after the sun went down. No one joined her. Not one neighbor even brought her water. Meanwhile, peace returned to the block. No more flyers, no more megaphones. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the quiet laps of water as we resumed drills, this time under stricter. The week after Karen's suspension from the HOA meetings was oddly peaceful, like the silence after a tornado has passed but the debris still hangs in the air. Her physical presence had vanished from the meetings, but her fingerprints were all over the chaos that lingered. The flyers had stopped, the protests were over, and her lawn chair vigil had folded up quietly after 3 days of sunburn, mosquito bites, and zero support. But I knew better than to assume she had given up. Karen wasn't the kind of person who accepted consequences with grace. She was the kind who rebranded failure as oppression and waited for the next opportunity to strike. So I didn't relax. I watched and I prepared. I continued working behind the scenes, documenting everything and cross-checking every legal angle. With her public image cracked and her credibility reduced to meme-level absurdity, I figured the next move would be quieter. But Karen had one more surprise up her sleeve, and it was the most reckless yet. It came to light during a surprise visit from a city inspector, who knocked on my front door late one Tuesday morning holding a clipboard and a very concerned look on his face. He introduced himself, said he was following up on a zoning complaint, and asked to inspect the perimeter of my property. I raised an eyebrow but allowed it. I had nothing to hide. As we walked around the edge of the property, he paused at the reinforced fence line and checked the measurement. Then he gestured to my pool equipment housing and asked if I had recently installed a new filtration system. I told him it had been there for years, part of the DoD's approved design. That's when he showed me the complaint. Someone had filed a formal report stating that I was operating an unauthorized facility, complete with military-grade surveillance, industrial water systems, and dangerous electrical wiring, all supposedly in violation of city safety code. The report was anonymous, but not really. The language, the dramatic flair, and even a few phrases lifted straight from Karen's earlier rants gave her away. I asked the inspector what the penalties were if the complaint were found to be fraudulent. He nodded slowly and said that misuse of the city's inspection system was a finable offense, especially when it wasted official resources. I thanked him, invited him in for coffee, and showed him the original signed documents, permits, and clearance records. He left not only satisfied but actually a little impressed, telling me he had never seen a residential pool with that much legal shielding. But now the game had changed. Karen was moving underground, trying to weaponize the system from behind the scenes. The next escalation came in the form of her house being flagged for inspection. I had nothing to do with it. That part was all her doing. When she made herself the self-declared neighborhood defense director, she'd quietly siphoned HOA funds toward what she labeled home safety upgrades. These included floodlights, unnecessary reinforcements to her garage that were built without permits, and a fake stone wall she claimed was a blast barrier. When the board reviewed the HOA's financials in the wake of her suspension, Raj found the discrepancies and flagged them to the city. Within days, Karen's property was swarming with officials. They found multiple violations. Her garage was structurally unsound due to unapproved demolition of a support wall. Her newly installed solar panel rig had been wired without a licensed electrician. She'd even laid down cement in a drainage path, backing up water across 3 neighboring properties. The city ordered immediate remediation. Fines were issued. One of the contractors she used admitted she paid in cash and refused to provide permit. It all came back to her, and this time there was no one left to blame. Her reaction was as dramatic as ever. She claimed it was a targeted attack by a shadow government operating from my backyard. She even went to the local paper with a letter, which they wisely declined to print. She then started a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely, but barely got 3 signatures, one of which was her cat's name, written in cursive. When that didn't work, she made flyers accusing me of being a deep state operative using community dues to build a private navy. Raj found one of the flyers folded into his mailbox and nearly choked on his coffee laughing. I hadn't said a word publicly through any of it. Not on social media. Not in the neighborhood group chat. I let the evidence speak for itself. And when the city concluded its investigation, they sent her a final notice. Cease all unauthorized work, correct existing violations, and pay the total fine within 30 days or risk further legal action. Karen's expression when she read that envelope on her porch was unforgettable. She was finally realizing she'd dug a hole so deep, there was no climbing out. Then came the HOA emergency meeting. It was called not by me, but by Clara, who had grown tired of the residual tension Karen had left behind. Everyone expected it to be another boring night of lawn complaints and dog poop policies, but Clara had planned something different. When the room was full, she turned on the projector and loaded a slideshow titled, "The Cost of Chaos, a Community Reckoning." Slide by slide, she walked the group through every false claim, every misuse of funds, every emergency service Karen had unnecessarily summoned. There were photos, audio clips, a breakdown of how much money had been spent dealing with her drama, police visits, inspections, and legal consultations. And then she invited me to speak. I didn't go for drama. I spoke plainly. I described what the training operation had been, what it was designed for, and how vital it had been for veterans like myself. I told them we weren't preparing for war. We were staying sharp, staying connected, and doing so with full approval from the Department of Defense. I ended with a single line. I said, Karen turned this into a battlefield because she didn't understand the difference between privacy and secrecy. And now the entire neighborhood paid the price for it. The room stayed silent for a moment, and then applause broke out. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. People had seen the full picture. The illusion was shattered. Karen didn't show her face at that meeting, though she claimed later she was detained by a suspicious humming noise from her fridge that may have been bugged. By the following weekend, her backyard was under partial demolition. Contractors showed up to tear down the illegal additions. Her ornamental koi pond, which she'd constructed in the common green space without approval, was drained. Her fake HOA patrol decals were removed from her SUV by order of the city. One by one, the walls of her fantasy crumbled. She still posted online, of course, but now her followers were mostly trolls and bots, and even those grew tired of her claims that her sprinkler system had been reprogrammed by government psyops. I kept training, quietly and with a renewed sense of calm. My team rotated in one more time before the end of the season. We ran drills under the moonlight again, this time without any unexpected cannonballs or flamingo float. The gates stayed locked, the perimeter secured, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't worry about what new madness might arrive from the other side of the fence. The final chapter of Karen's unraveling didn't come with sirens or some dramatic courthouse battle. It came with silence, the kind that settles in when someone finally realizes the world has moved on without them. The noise she had generated, the hysteria, the late-night Facebook rants, and HOA announcements scrawled in Comic Sans had faded into background static. Where once she had been the queen of overreach, she was now a cautionary tale told in neighborhood whispers. Her lawn chair protest at the edge of my property line disappeared one morning without a word, replaced by a wilted patch of grass and the lingering scent of citronella. Nobody missed it. My backyard returned to what it had always been, a sanctuary of discipline and trust. The SEAL team resumed drills with a new sense of confidence, knowing the risk of exposure had passed. I didn't need to say it out loud, but everyone involved knew we had weathered something rare and ridiculous. When your enemies are predictable, you train. But when your enemies are absurd, like a wine-wielding woman on a flamingo claiming military espionage, you adapt. And we had adapted. Every sensor on the perimeter was recalibrated, every piece of gear double-checked. Our drills continued under tighter protocol, and the men were sharper than ever. But beyond the logistics, there was something deeper, an unspoken bond formed by the chaos Karen had brought. We'd fought through it not with bullets or brute force, but with patience, evidence, and strategy. Still, there was one final piece to put in place. I had held on to it, unsure if I'd ever use it. It was the full, unedited compilation of Karen's trespasses, rants, and self-recorded conspiracies. Footage from every angle, including her impromptu infiltration in camo where she fell into the pool shrieking like a seagull tangled in tinsel. I hadn't shared it publicly, but I had it. Not as leverage, not for revenge, but as a failsafe, in case she ever tried to flip the narrative one more time. But as time passed and she grew quieter, I realized something. The community no longer needed the footage. They had seen enough. She had made herself a parody. Then came the email that made me laugh out loud. It was from a local documentary filmmaker who had stumbled across Karen's viral footage and wanted to make a short feature on suburban extremism and the rise of HOA vigilantes. He asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed, anonymously if I preferred, as the man in the middle of the aquatic standoff. I declined, politely. There was no need to fan flames that were finally dying out. Besides, the last thing I wanted was for Karen to gain even a sliver of fame from this circus. The filmmaker understood, though he asked if he could include my story in fictionalized form. I told him to change the name of the neighborhood and to make the pool much smaller. Ironically, it was Raj who suggested we immortalize the moment in a way Karen could never control. At the next HOA gathering, which now took place with food trucks, music, and actual neighborly joy, he unveiled a commemorative plaque. Not made of stone or metal, but wood, hand-carved by one of the veterans in the unit. It read, "In honor of the great pool incident, may future cannonballs be sanctioned." It got a laugh from everyone. Even Ben, who rarely smiled, cracked up. We hung it near the neighborhood entrance, not as mockery, but as a reminder of what happens when entitlement tries to drown out reason. As summer wore on, Karen's presence became barely noticeable. Her house went up for sale quietly in the early fall, listed by an out-of-town realtor. Rumors swirled that she was moving to a community with less oversight, somewhere she could reclaim her voice without deep state surveillance. When the moving trucks finally pulled up, no one came to help. No goodbyes, no farewell cupcake. Just one last scene of Karen yelling at the driver for stacking her freedom crystals too close to her wind chimes. When she left, the air actually felt lighter. That evening, I sat alone by the pool, not as a soldier, not as a homeowner under siege, but just as myself. The water was still, and for once, there was no urgency in its reflection. I had spent months dealing with the kind of irrationality you can't train for. But I had come out of it with more than just the satisfaction of surviving it. I had allies I didn't know I had. Neighbors who now respected the quiet instead of fearing it. And a community that finally understood that privacy doesn't mean secrecy. It means trust. I was still cautious, of course. You don't go through something like that without keeping your guard up. But the need for constant vigilance faded. The gate stayed locked, but now it was more symbolic than defensive. Clara brought her kids by once just to say hi. Raj stopped in to drop off a joke version of a neighborhood newsletter featuring fake headlines like "Local Man Builds Secret Spaceship Under HOA Tennis Court" and "Karen Arrested for Declaring Martial Law at the Farmer's Market." And that's how the story settled. Not with fire and fury, but with resilience and quiet redemption. The SEAL team would return the following season for another round of training, this time with tighter coordination and a fully digitized clearance system. No more surprises. No more cannonballs. One afternoon in late fall, I received a small package. No name, no return address, just a note inside that read, "Maybe I went too far. Maybe you're not the enemy I thought. Sorry. I'm starting over." Tucked inside the envelope was a small ceramic flamingo, cracked at the beak but intact enough to recognize. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It wasn't even a real apology. But it was something. A flicker of awareness, maybe. Or just an awkward attempt at closure? I placed it on the shelf in the equipment shack. No fanfare. Just one strange artifact to remind me of what had happened. And then I moved on. Karen had jumped my fence thinking it was just another backyard she could claim, another space she could invade with entitlement wrapped in sunscreen and passive aggression. She hadn't known it was a training ground built on decades of discipline, guarded not by rage or pride, but by purpose. She thought she could swim in my world. But in the end, she drowned in her own delusions. Now the water was still. The noise was gone. The gate stood tall. And peace, earned and steady, returned like a tide that finally turned. Ask ChatGPT.